Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the muddy cobblestones of a medieval town, somewhere between a blacksmith's anvil ringing through the air and the smell of turnip stew drifting out of a crooked tavern window. The sun is dipping behind the thatched rooftops, casting long shadows on market stalls where bread is being sold next to bundles of dried herbs and slightly suspicious-looking eels. There's a gentle clatter of wooden carts, the occasional neigh of a horse, and somewhere, yes, just past the tannery, a sound you wouldn't expect to hear echoing through the public square, someone crying. Now, it's not the wail of mourning at a funeral, nor the gentle sniffles of someone watching a romantic puppet play. It's loud, messy, inconsolable sobbing. Someone has absolutely lost it in the middle of the fishmongers and radish sellers. And just like that, time slows. Heads turn. A friar lifts an eyebrow. The butcher stops sharpening his cleaver. Because here, in this oddly specific slice of the Middle Ages, public crying isn't just awkward. It's a problem. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're here, post your location and local time in the comments. I always love seeing where you're all listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You don't realize it yet, but you've been quietly dropped into a moment in time where emotions were supposed to be private, and if they spilled into the town square, people started to panic a little. The rules weren't written down in neon lights, obviously. This was the Middle Ages, but society had a very clear sense of what emotions belonged where. Now imagine this. A woman in a frayed wool cloak sits down on the stone ledge of a well. She clutches something close, maybe a bundle of cloth, maybe a letter, maybe nothing at all, and tears stream down her face. Her shoulders shake, her sobs echo off the plaster walls. And you're sitting on a wooden bench nearby, munching something you deeply regret purchasing from a suspicious pie vendor. You watch the crowd shift, not toward her, but away. As if crying is contagious, like it might leak into your bones. In some medieval towns, public crying wasn't just a social faux pas. It could be interpreted as anything from mental instability to spiritual danger. The church, always eager to weigh in, viewed overt emotional outbursts as signs of imbalance, perhaps even demonic affliction. And if you were crying outside designated mourning rituals, like funerals, fast days, or saint feast processions, well, now you were just drawing attention to yourself. And that was the medieval equivalent of showing up to a wedding in white, but worse. One mainstream historical fact we know is that town charters and civic ordinances often included sections on public conduct, usually buried between notes on grain measurement and pig keeping, and while they rarely singled out crying by name, they did mention causing a disturbance. Emotional outbursts could be included under that vague umbrella, especially in larger towns like York, Paris, or Florence, where public order was policed with surprising enthusiasm. Of course, the way townsfolk reacted to a weeping person had layers. Was the crier male or female? Rich or poor? Known or stranger? If a well-known widow broke down near the shrine of a local saint, people might murmur their sympathy. But if a ragged outsider burst into tears near the Merchant Guild Hall, there was a decent chance someone would shout for a constable. A few towns even had informal weep watchers, usually nosy older women, who kept a running tab on emotional scenes. You might think, okay, surely crying is normal when you've lost someone, right? Well, yes, but even grief had etiquette. Some scholars argue that the regulation of public mourning reflected broader efforts to control the body, especially women's bodies, and emotions. You could grieve, yes, but not too loudly, not too long, and please, not on market day. Nobody wants their radishes salted by someone else's tears. Now, here's a strange little fringe tidbit. In parts of 13th century Germany, there were local sayings that described a person who cried in public as having dropped their soul in the street. It was a poetic insult, suggesting someone had lost not just composure, but their inner integrity. People feared that uncontrolled weeping could literally spill your soul out through your eyes. And of course, no one wanted to step in that. So there's the tension between the intensely personal act of crying and the medieval obsession with order, hierarchy, and visible piety. You couldn't just walk around leaking emotion without triggering an entire spectrum of responses, from sympathetic head tilts to outright suspicion. But there were exceptions. If you happened to cry near a holy relic, let's say, a fragment of St. Cuthbert's toenail, then your tears could be interpreted as signs of divine inspiration. People might gather, nod approvingly, maybe even join in. One person's breakdown became a collective religious event. Which, I guess, is nice. As long as you were crying for the right reasons. It's also worth noting that some historians still argue whether medieval emotional expression was actually more open than we assume. After all, the medieval world was drenched in pageantry, lament, and drama. People sang dirges. They wore mourning hoods. Monks wrote weepy prayers that made modern breakup songs look subtle. So maybe it wasn't crying itself that was the problem. It was context. Cry at the wrong time, wrong place, wrong volume. You were either sinful, suspicious, or, worse, embarrassing. Let's pause for a moment and picture you walking down a medieval alleyway. The stone walls are damp. You pass a woman singing a lullaby to herself, swaying slightly. You can't tell if she's praying or weeping. People glance but say nothing. The town has learned to absorb certain types of sorrow, just not the ones that interrupt the usual flow of commerce or piety. Now here's one of those subtle ironies. While you're discouraged from crying too openly in public, you'll find entire sections of medieval devotional manuals, especially for women, encouraging private weeping. Crying was said to cleanse the soul, humble the spirit, and draw you closer to God. But again, privately, quietly, respectably, maybe under a hood, maybe behind a curtain. Ideally, with a candle flickering nearby and some incense wafting around so nobody notices your nose is running. So now you're starting to get the picture. A medieval town square wasn't just a place for bread buying and gossip, it was a stage. And like any stage, it came with rules. One of the biggest: don't disrupt the script. And crying, unless pre-approved, was a scene stealer. And if you're wondering, yes, you could be reported. So-and-so was crying loudly by the well. That might be the start of a civic complaint, especially if it happened repeatedly. It could even spiral into accusations of madness, unholy behavior, or just being troubled. And back then, troubled could get you sent to the edge of town, literally or metaphorically. That's the emotional tightrope people walked. You were allowed feelings, but not too many. You were permitted grief, but keep it orderly. Show too much pain and you risked not just judgment, but consequences. That's how towns protected their peace, by managing their noise. And tears? Tears were noisy. And somewhere, in all of this, is that poor woman by the well, still crying. Or maybe she's done now. Maybe she dried her eyes and slipped away down a side alley before anyone could report her. Maybe she's muttering a prayer. Or maybe she's plotting revenge. You know, medieval women were excellent at multitasking. We'll come back to her later. But first, let's look at how the town itself, not just its people, began to codify what to do with all this inconvenient emotion. The mood in the marketplace may have moved on, but the echoes of those sobs still bounce off the walls of your imagination. You keep walking, slower now, because something about that outburst, the suddenness of it, the sheer volume, has unsettled the rhythm of your afternoon. And it seems you're not the only one. A group of merchants has huddled near their carts, exchanging glances that hover somewhere between irritation and concern. One of them, a man with suspiciously clean boots, mutters the phrase that gives tonight's story its shape: another public disturbance. Because in medieval towns, crying wasn't always just crying. It could be noise. It could be disorder. And disorder, that was the beginning of chaos. And chaos, as any good alderman would tell you, was the beginning of sin, plague, and slightly higher taxes. Now, let's be clear, medieval people weren't heartless. They were just deeply committed to order, more so than you might think. In a society where even bread sizes were regulated and shoemakers had to register their apprentices with the guild, everything had its proper place. And emotions, inconveniently messy as they were, had to be tucked into appropriate categories. Crying wasn't banned, exactly, but loud crying, prolonged crying, sudden crying, that was a problem. One mainstream historical fact worth knowing: by the late 13th century, many growing towns had appointed officials to monitor public behavior. Sometimes called reeves, watchmen, or constables, these were the medieval precursors to modern law enforcement. And yes, they kept an eye and ear out for noise. Disturbing the peace was a legitimate legal concern. And if your weeping attracted a crowd or caused a market to halt for even a moment, that was a cause of commotion, and you could be hauled before the local magistrate faster than you could say, "I just needed a good cry." Some towns even had specific hours during which noise had to be kept to a minimum. Bells might ring at sunset not just to mark curfew, but to signal the start of quiet hours. Public weeping that broke the silence wasn't just annoying, it was suspect, especially if it wasn't tied to a clear religious or civic event. Picture someone sobbing during a fish auction. The fishmonger loses his crowd. The other vendors complain. And before long, the poor weeper is at the center of a scene, the cardinal sin of urban life. But what about intent, you ask? Couldn't someone just say, "I'm grieving," or "my goat ran away," and be excused? Well, yes and no. Because medieval justice wasn't blind, it was nosy. It cared deeply about why you were crying, how long you'd been doing it, and who you were. If you were a noblewoman in a veil, your sobs might be interpreted as the noble lamentation of a refined soul. But if you were a toothless washerwoman wailing by the town well, it might be seen as drunkenness, madness, or even heresy. Now here's a deliciously odd fringe detail. In certain parts of Flanders during the 14th century, public crying was occasionally linked to supernatural disruption. There are records of people being accused of summoning spirits or attracting misfortune through excessive emotional outbursts. One woman in Ghent was said to have cried so persistently that the birds stopped singing. Highly unlikely, but poetic. And in a time when omens were taken seriously, it wasn't just poetic, it was dangerous. And that brings us to one of the open scholarly debates on this topic. Were medieval authorities genuinely worried about crying, or was it just an excuse to control women and the poor? Some historians argue that crying wasn't viewed as dangerous in itself, but rather as a visible symptom of people stepping outside their expected social roles. Emotional expression became an indirect way to monitor rebellion, dissent, or even mental health. After all, no one wants to admit their town is full of people who are unhappy. Much easier to say it's full of people who are noisy. And let's not forget the ever-watchful eye of the church. Religious officials were constantly worried about sin leaking into public life like an unattended cheese gone moldy. Public displays of emotion were often lumped together with scandalous behavior. Weeping without explanation could be seen as a failure of self-control, a breakdown of the godly, rational mind. Even in confessionals, priests might warn parishioners against excessive sorrow, which was considered spiritually corrosive. Of course, some crying was acceptable, especially when paired with proper posture and purpose. You could cry at funerals. You could cry during a passion play. You could cry while receiving communion, especially if your tears were described as holy moisture, a term that definitely sounds like something medieval monks should have trademarked. But outside those sacred bubbles, keep it together, friend. Let's bring you back to our imaginary town square. You walk past the well where the weeper once Saturday. She's gone now, But in her place stands a young boy with a crooked nose and a basket of potatoes. He's telling anyone who'll listen that the crying woman cursed his carrots. No one quite believes him, but they all nod, just in case. In a world where crying might signal madness, magic, or mourning, it's better to play it safe. Now, let's have a little fun imagining how this might play out in real time. Say you suddenly burst into tears at the market. You sob into your sleeve, collapse dramatically onto a wooden barrel, and start muttering about lost love and stolen chickens. Here's the sequence of responses you might get. An old woman clutches her rosary and starts praying loudly. A baker assumes you've been hexed. A constable appears, asking what business your wailing is interfering with. A nearby child begins to cry in solidarity, causing a feedback loop of chaos. Someone, somewhere, says, "We should call the bishop." It's absurd, but not far off. That's how visible emotions could ripple through a tight-knit community. People didn't just see you, they interpreted you. And interpretation came with consequences. Even tradespeople had a stake in the emotional environment. A noisy crier could ruin the mood of a deal. A moaning widow might sour a day's shopping. There were even scattered reports of people being banned from marketplaces for melancholic outbursts. Which is a medieval way of saying, go cry somewhere else. Interestingly, though, there were occasional reversals. In times of plague or famine, crying became more acceptable, because it matched the collective tone. It wasn't disruptive anymore. It was harmonious. A whole town weeping together was a sign of shared trauma, not personal failing. Some chroniclers even describe processions where townsfolk cried as they walked through the streets, hoping their tears would persuade God to relent. In moments like that, public crying wasn't just allowed, it was encouraged. But once the crisis passed, the rules snapped back. You weren't supposed to be too sad for too long. There was work to be done. Fields to till. Horses to shoe. Peasants to oppress. You get the idea. So we return to the idea of crying as a kind of public performance, one with rules, boundaries, and acceptable scripts. Step outside that script, and the town might not forgive you. Not because they hated emotion, but because they feared what it meant when someone lost control. What else might spill out? Secrets? Rage? Heresy? We're only scratching the surface, of course. But as you stroll through the town square, past the gossiping bakers, the sighing friars, and the bored apprentices, it's clear that crying isn't just a sound here. It's a signal. And everyone's watching. We'll talk more soon about how specific roles, like mourners and even town criers, could legally and socially own the public soundscape. But for now, maybe hold those tears in just a bit longer. At least until you're behind closed doors. Or under a cloak. Or, safely inside a chapel, where crying might finally be seen as a virtue again. As you settle into the rhythm of the town's murmur and clatter, you start to notice something fascinating. Not all crying is created equal. In fact, medieval townsfolk were surprisingly skilled at sorting tears into categories. There were the acceptable tears, the necessary tears, and then the downright problematic ones. And these distinctions mattered. Big time. Take, for example, the categories of criers, moaners, and mourners. These weren't just poetic labels. They represented social roles that determined how your tears would be received, or punished. First up, the criers. These were the loud, often unwanted emotional explosions in public. The sobbing woman by the well, the man bellowing about his lost livelihood, the child screaming over a broken toy. The criers were seen as disruptions. They forced the town to pause and pay attention, whether it wanted to or not. And town authorities didn't love that. They were the kind of crying that drew constables, raised eyebrows, and sometimes led to fines. Then there were the moaners. These people were a bit subtler. Their grief was quieter, less explosive, but still noticeable. Imagine a widow gently rocking back and forth, making soft, rhythmic sounds of lamentation outside her house. The moaner's tears were more socially acceptable because they signaled grief without demanding immediate action. They were a kind of emotional background music to daily life, acknowledged, but not disruptive. Finally, we come to the mourners, those who cried with purpose and ceremony. Funerals, memorials, religious processions, these were their stages. Their tears were sanctioned by custom, ritual, and sometimes payment. These were the public performances that adhered to script, protocol, and expectation. And, crucially, mourners often had an audience that was expected to watch, feel, and respond. One mainstream historical fact you'll find is that in many medieval communities, there were paid professional mourners. Yes, people whose job was literally to cry. They showed up at funerals and made sure the deceased received the appropriate level of public sorrow. Why? Because mourning was a kind of social currency, a sign of respect, status, and community cohesion. If a noble died and no one cried enough, it was seen as a slight to the family's honor. That's where these professional wailers came in, offering their tearful services to ensure the mourning met the town's expectations. Professional mourners could be incredibly theatrical. Some would tear at their hair, others would keening wail so loud it could shatter a window. Sometimes, they'd even fake fainting spells or convulsions, all part of convincing the crowd of their sincere grief. It was a performance, yes, but an essential one, because public mourning was about showing grief as much as feeling it. Here's an unusual fringe tidbit for you. In certain parts of Eastern Europe during the late Middle Ages, professional mourners would sometimes be hired weeks in advance of a funeral, and they would rehearse their cries. Yes, really. There are records suggesting these rehearsals involved fine-tuning volume, pitch, and timing, almost like a sad, woeful theatre troupe dedicated to sorrow. The best mourners could command quite high fees, especially in wealthier cities. But here's where things get complicated. Not everyone loved the idea of professional mourning. Some locals saw these hired criers as insincere or even manipulative, crying for money rather than genuine sorrow. There's a historical debate about whether professional mourners sometimes used their skills to influence public opinion, perhaps stirring sympathy for political ends or family rivalries. Were the tears always real? Probably not. Were the intentions always pure? Definitely questionable. And that leads us to a broader open scholarly debate about the nature of public emotion in medieval towns. Was emotional expression genuinely heartfelt or a kind of social performance? Some historians argue that much of public mourning and crying was performative, part ritual, part obligation. Others believe these expressions were deeply sincere, rooted in personal loss and spiritual beliefs. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. After all, even today, tears can be both real and performative. Now, if you think the town was only concerned with professional mourners, think again. The church had its own emotional hierarchy. Some forms of weeping were encouraged, tears shed during confession, prayer, or meditation, while others were discouraged or even punished. Too much crying could be seen as a sign of spiritual weakness or even demonic influence. There's also the tricky matter of gender expectations surrounding crying, which we'll explore more later. But suffice it to say, men and women were given very different emotional scripts. Women were often allowed, and even expected, to cry more, but within certain limits. Men, on the other hand, were usually expected to keep their tears under tight control. Crying men could be accused of cowardice or worse. Imagine now, strolling through a funeral procession where a group of hired mourners is performing their duties. Their cries rise and fall in a carefully orchestrated chorus, echoing off the stone walls. Townsfolk gather, some nodding solemnly, others rolling their eyes at the spectacle. Children peek from behind doors, trying to decide if they want to join in or run away. The deceased's family watches closely, measuring the performance's adequacy. But behind the theatrical wailing, there's a genuine undercurrent of loss. For the widow, the heir, the neighbor, these tears serve both to honor the dead and to ease the unbearable weight of grief. It's a strange blend of authenticity and artifice, community and performance. Meanwhile, the common criers, the ones who blubbered outside of funerals, in markets or taverns, were rarely so lucky. They were the outliers, the emotional rebels who disrupted the carefully managed flow of town life. Their tears marked them as outsiders, possibly mad, possibly possessed, or just plain troublesome. The official response to these criers was often swift and practical. Local authorities might impose fines, order the crying to cease, or even banish persistent weepers from public spaces. Town ordinances sometimes specified punishments for disturbing the peace, which, while vague, included unseemly wailing and lamentations. Now here's a light joke to break the mood. Imagine a medieval town hall meeting where the aldermen debate, resolved, henceforth, all crying must be kept to a dull roar. No shrieks louder than the town crier's bell. Yes, it sounds absurd, but that's how seriously noise was taken. Another joke, if you cried during the market, the constable might say, "Sir, is this a tear of sorrow or just bad onion chopping?" Tough crowd. And one more. Why did the medieval woman bring a handkerchief to the market? To avoid getting fined for tear stains on her dress, of course. But beneath the humor, these regulations reveal a medieval world deeply concerned with managing emotion, noise, and social order. To wrap up this section, medieval towns had a surprisingly complex taxonomy of tears. Criers caused trouble, moaners were tolerated, mourners were often professionals, blending grief and performance into public ritual. And all of it was carefully monitored by both civic and ecclesiastical authorities. So the next time you find yourself overwhelmed by emotion, remember the poor soul who couldn't cry freely without drawing the town's suspicion, or worse. In medieval times, tears were a tricky business. Not just because of feelings, but because of rules. You're doing fine. Hold it together just a bit longer. You've learned that the church wasn't just interested in sermons and sacraments, it was also a major player in policing tears. And that's where things get especially interesting. Because in medieval towns, the boundary between spiritual and civic life was blurrier than the morning mist rolling off the moors. The church, with its towering cathedrals and secretive cloisters, held immense power over how people expressed emotion in public. And when it came to crying, ecclesiastical authorities had a very specific playbook. One of the key tools in their emotional regulation arsenal was the use of fines and penances. Imagine you're attending Mass on a Sunday morning, hoping for a quiet moment with the Almighty. Instead, someone near you bursts into loud, uncontrollable sobs. The priest, trying not to spill his communion wine, might pause mid-ritual and silently mark you down for disorderly conduct. It sounds harsh, but it wasn't unusual. Ecclesiastical courts frequently fined or imposed penances on parishioners who displayed excessive or unseemly weeping during services. Why? Because church leaders wanted worship to be orderly and reverent. Too much crying was seen as a distraction, or worse, a sign of spiritual imbalance. A mainstream historical fact is that church regulations in towns like medieval Paris or Canterbury included explicit rules about emotional decorum. Parishioners were expected to control their tears during sermons and masses. If you cried at the wrong moment, or too loudly, you risked public reprimand or penance, such as fasting, prayer, or even public confession. But there's a fascinating twist. The church didn't simply ban crying, it sometimes encouraged it, at very specific times and for very specific reasons. Tears shed during prayer, confession, or mourning for the dead were considered holy. There's an old Latin phrase you might like, lacrimae devotionis, or tears of devotion. Those tears were good, pious even. They symbolized repentance, humility, and closeness to God. So the church's stance wasn't simple "no tears allowed." It was more like, crying is good if it's holy and quiet. Crying is bad if it's noisy and disruptive.
Subtle, right?
Here's a fringe tidbit for you. In some monasteries, crying was literally part of the spiritual exercise. Monks were encouraged to meditate on their sins until they wept, sometimes loudly and publicly. This was thought to cleanse the soul and draw the individual closer to divine grace. But these cries happened within the monastery walls, far from the public eye. Outside those walls, however, public crying risked being branded as hysteria, madness, or worse. Women were particularly vulnerable to such accusations, as emotional excess was often equated with weakness or demonic possession. That leads us to an open scholarly debate. Were church authorities genuinely trying to regulate spiritual behavior, or was emotional control a tool of social control, especially over women? Some historians argue that by policing women's tears, the church reinforced patriarchal norms and limited women's autonomy. Others see these regulations as sincere attempts to maintain order and reverence in sacred spaces. Again, probably a bit of both. There's also evidence that the church viewed some kinds of crying as dangerous because they might lead to false piety or manipulation. Imagine someone who cries constantly during services, not out of genuine grief, but to gain attention or favor. The priests called this weeping hypocrisy and condemned it harshly. So how did townsfolk navigate this tricky emotional landscape? Well, a popular practice was to offer small fines or penances for public crying that was deemed inappropriate. These fines could be paid in coin, labor, or acts of charity. Sometimes, the church kept detailed records of these penalties, giving us a glimpse into just how often tears made people's lives complicated. But there's another layer. The church also acted as a mediator in public mourning. For example, during funerals, the priest might coordinate when and where mourners could cry, sing, or wail. The goal was to ensure that grief was expressed in ways that honored God and the dead, without turning into chaos. Picture a funeral procession winding through narrow streets, with a choir of mourners led by clergy chanting samba hymns. Tears flow freely, but within limits. Too much noise, and the priest would raise his hand, reminding everyone to keep the mourning dignified. And this brings us to a light joke. Why don't priests cry in public? Because it's a grave situation. Too soon? Too soon. Another, what's a medieval bishop's favorite instrument? The weeping willow. And one more, why did the nun bring a tissue to the sermon? To keep her vows dry. But beyond the humor lies the serious truth that the church's influence on emotional expression was profound. It shaped not just what people cried about, but how, when, and where. Interestingly, some records show that the church sometimes encouraged tears as a sign of genuine repentance. Parishioners were urged to cry during confession to demonstrate true sorrow for sins. Yet, this crying was expected to be private and controlled, not loud bawling in the market square. And of course, all of this is intertwined with medieval medical beliefs. The humoral theory suggested that too much crying could imbalance the body's four humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, leading to illness. So priests and doctors alike warned against excessive weeping, linking it to physical and spiritual harm. So, as you imagine this medieval world, consider how people had to balance personal pain with public expectations, spiritual devotion with social order. Cry too little, and you might be seen as cold or heretical. Cry too much, and you risk fines, scorn, or worse. We'll soon explore how these emotional tightropes affected gender roles. But for now, picture yourself sitting quietly in a dim chapel, candlelight flickering, as a soft chorus of controlled sobs echoes through the stone halls. Those are the approved tears, holy, subdued, and sanctioned. Outside, the world waits with judgmental ears and watchful eyes. As the quiet flicker of candles in the chapel fades from your mind, you step back into the bustling medieval town and find yourself thinking about something that seems almost unfair: the double standards when it came to women, grief, and expectations. You might guess that women were allowed to cry more than men, and you'd be right, but that permission came with strings longer than a priest's sermon. Women's crying was expected, even demanded, in certain contexts, especially during mourning or religious rituals. It was part of the performance of femininity, piety, and social roles. But, and this is a big but, the line between acceptable tears and hysterical outbursts was razor thin. You see, medieval society was obsessed with modesty and control. Women were supposed to express grief, yes, but in a way that reflected decorum, dignity, and sometimes silence. Tearful women who screamed or wailed too loudly could be labeled as disruptive or even mad. And that could lead to serious consequences. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval legal codes sometimes referenced women who disturbed the peace by crying loudly in public spaces. The punishments varied but could include fines or forced silence. So your tears had better be just so. On the other hand, if you didn't cry enough, especially at funerals or wakes, you risked social judgment for being cold or uncaring. Imagine a noblewoman at her husband's funeral with a poker face. The gossips would be ruthless. So women were caught in a delicate balance. Be emotional enough to show proper grief, but not so emotional that you were a public nuisance. The church also played a role here, emphasizing women's emotional susceptibility as a sign of spiritual weakness, but also encouraging tears as a form of penance and humility. Nuns, in particular, were often encouraged to shed tears for the sins of the world, but within the confines of convent walls. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. In some medieval medical texts, women's tears were thought to be a sign of an imbalance of melancholy or hysteria, the latter from the Greek word hystra, meaning uterus. The wandering womb was blamed for causing emotional excess, and women's tears were sometimes dismissed as mere physical symptoms of this supposed condition. So, not only were women's tears policed socially, but their very capacity to cry was medicalized and pathologized. This brings us to one of the most enduring open scholarly debates about medieval gender and emotion. Were women's tears genuinely expressions of sorrow, or were they socially constructed performances shaped by strict norms and medical theories? Some historians argue that women found in their tears a rare form of agency, a way to express otherwise silenced feelings. Others suggest tears were a kind of emotional trap, keeping women in roles of vulnerability and submission. Meanwhile, men were held to a starkly different standard. Public crying by men was often seen as weakness or even shameful. Nobles and knights were expected to embody stoicism, bravery, and control. Tears from men could undermine their authority or invite mockery. But, of course, there were exceptions. Certain situations allowed, or even demanded, men to show grief. For example, a king mourning a fallen comrade might shed tears in public as a display of noble sorrow and human empathy. Yet these moments were carefully staged and interpreted through political lenses. Picture a knight at a funeral, his eyes glistening with tears but his voice steady as he recites a eulogy. His tears serve a purpose, signaling loyalty, honor, and depth of feeling. But too much, and he risks looking unmanly. One amusing historical anecdote comes from a 14th century court record where a nobleman was reprimanded for weeping too loudly during a trial. The judge, trying to maintain order, reportedly told him, "Sir, your tears do more harm to the court than your words." It's both a joke and a serious commentary on the expectations of masculine emotional restraint. Here's a light-hearted joke for you. Why don't medieval knights cry in battle? Because their armor is too heavy for tears to escape. Okay, a bit grim. And one more. What did the medieval man say when asked why he never cried? "I prefer to keep my feelings under chainmail." These gendered emotional norms didn't just affect individuals. They shaped community responses to crying. Women's tears were often interpreted as genuine grief or spiritual struggle, but also sometimes as manipulative or dangerous. Men's tears were scrutinized for their authenticity and appropriateness. In this social landscape, crying was never just personal. It was public, political, and often perilous. But what about those times when crying was business? When tears weren't just an expression of sorrow but a paid service? We'll explore that next. For now, imagine a widow in the town square, her face streaked with tears, performing the socially acceptable version of grief. Her tears are expected, but so is her composure. She's walking a tightrope, balancing public expectation, personal pain, and the watchful eyes of neighbors and clergy. And you, listening in, feel the weight of those expectations. Crying was never just about sadness, it was about survival. Let's wander now into the somber yet strangely theatrical world of professional mourners and wailers. People who made crying their livelihood, turning grief into a kind of performance art. Yes, in the medieval period, it wasn't unusual for families to hire experts whose sole job was to cry loudly and convincingly at funerals and wakes. This wasn't just a quaint custom. It was a vital part of how medieval townsfolk processed death and upheld social customs. Picture this. You're at a funeral in a cobblestone town square. The coffin is laid out, the priest intones prayers, and suddenly a chorus of professional mourners bursts into heart-wrenching wails. Their cries rise and fall like a symphony of sorrow, their hands tearing at their hair, faces contorted in anguish. The crowd watches, some dabbing at their own eyes, others nodding in approval. This is the show of grief that the community expects and needs. Professional mourners were often women, skilled in the art of lamentation. They knew exactly how to deliver a gut-wrenching cry or a soft sob to elicit sympathy and respect. Their performances were both a service to the deceased's family and a public declaration of loss that helped bind the community together. One mainstream historical fact is that these mourners could command surprisingly high fees, especially for wealthy families who wanted to ensure their loved ones were honored with the proper level of public grief. Some records from medieval Italy and the Balkans describe contracts for mourners to attend not just funerals but also memorial services weeks after death. But it wasn't all sincere sadness. Sometimes these professional cries were theatrical, exaggerated, and designed to make a statement. If a powerful noble family hired a large troupe of mourners, it was a way to display status and influence. It said, "Look how beloved this person was." It was emotional spectacle as social currency. Here's an unusual fringe tidbit. In parts of Eastern Europe, professional mourners would sometimes be trained in specific lamentation styles. They'd practice different wails for different occasions. Soft, weeping cries for personal grief. Loud, sharp shrieks for communal tragedy. Rhythmic chants for religious solemnity. Some mourners even had signature styles, recognizable across regions. This tradition wasn't without controversy. Some townsfolk saw professional mourning as a kind of emotional fraud, a paid performance that cheapened genuine grief. The church occasionally condemned it as theatrical vanity, warning that such displays distracted from true penitence. Which brings us to a lively, open, scholarly debate. Were professional mourners exploitative performers or vital community mourners? Some historians argue that these women provided an essential social service, helping people express grief that might otherwise be repressed. Others see professional mourning as commodification of sorrow, blurring the lines between authentic feeling and public spectacle. In practical terms, professional mourners helped channel communal grief, making death a visible, shared experience rather than a private sorrow. Their cries also enforced social norms around mourning: the right volume, the proper gestures, the expected timing. Without them, funerals might have been quieter, less unified, and perhaps more emotionally chaotic. Imagine the scene again. The town's best-known professional mourner, a woman named Agnes, arrives with her small troupe. They begin with a keening wail that pierces the cool morning air. Tears run down her cheeks, but whether they are real or rehearsed, no one questions. It's what the town expects. Yet, the role wasn't always glamorous. Professional mourners sometimes faced suspicion, envy, and even scorn. Their livelihoods depended on public displays of pain, a heavy emotional burden to carry daily. And because their profession centered on women's emotional expression, it was often devalued or trivialized by men in power. There's also a funny historical note tucked in here. Some records joke about mourners who got carried away and cried so hard they fainted, only to snap back awake and start all over again. That's dedication. Or maybe just job security. Another joke. Why did the professional mourner bring a bucket to the funeral? To collect tears for her next performance. And one more. What's a mourner's favorite dance? The weep step. Beyond funerals, professional mourners sometimes played roles in other public rituals, weddings, religious festivals, and political events. Their presence marked the emotional significance of the occasion, signaling to everyone watching that this was a moment worth feeling deeply about. As you reflect on this, consider the paradox of mourning as both deeply personal and highly public. In a medieval town, sorrow was not just a private experience. It was a social event, carefully choreographed and watched. Professional mourners were the experts who knew how to play their part perfectly. We'll soon explore how other social groups, like guilds and town criers, fit into this complex emotional tapestry. But for now, think of the professional mourner as a symbol of medieval attitudes toward tears. Regulated, performative, and profoundly meaningful. Your own eyes might feel heavy now, as if you're carrying the weight of all those silent, visible sorrows. That's exactly the mood of medieval public crying, at once a burden and a bond. As you leave behind the mourner's lament and the hush of funerals, your footsteps take you deeper into the heart of the medieval town, right into the workshops and narrow streets where guilds shaped everyday life, including how emotions like crying were managed and even regulated. Yes, those guilds, famous for controlling trade secrets and apprenticeships, also had surprisingly strict rules about public behavior and emotional conduct. Imagine the clang of hammer on anvil, the thick smell of leather and wood shavings, and the chorus of apprentices and masters at work. Now, amid the focus and labor, there's a shared understanding. Crying on the job is not acceptable. Guilds enforced discipline not only for productivity, but to maintain the dignity and reputation of their craft. One mainstream historical fact is that many guild charters included clauses about apprentice behavior, demanding control over temper and emotion. An apprentice caught crying in frustration or sorrow might face reprimand, extra labor, or even expulsion. Guilds believed emotional outbursts undermined the quality of work and the collective respectability of the craft. But the guilds weren't just about suppression. They also created spaces for controlled emotional expression. Festivals and feast days, often organized by guilds, included rituals where public displays of grief or joy were allowed. For example, during the feast of Saint Crispin, the patron saint of shoemakers, guild members might publicly mourn a lost comrade or celebrate with raucous joy, emotions safely contained within accepted norms. Guild halls sometimes hosted mourning ceremonies for deceased members. These were formal events with prescribed rituals for crying and lamentation. Public weeping was permitted here, but always with decorum and respect for tradition. Here's a fringe tidbit. Some guilds had specific officers whose role included overseeing the emotional discipline of members, ensuring that apprentices didn't let feelings interfere with work, and that masters maintained a stern, authoritative presence. These emotional supervisors were less about sympathy and more about order. Think of them as medieval HR managers with a whip instead of a clipboard. This brings us to a fascinating open scholarly debate. To what extent did guilds' control over emotional expression reflect broader societal efforts to discipline bodies and minds? Some scholars argue that regulating tears was part of a larger project of social control, ensuring workers were productive, obedient, and respectable. Others suggest guilds recognized that emotions were powerful social tools, and by managing them carefully, they could strengthen group cohesion. As you wander past workshops, you overhear a gruff blacksmith chastising his apprentice for shedding tears over a botched horseshoe. "Steel waits for no sorrow," he mutters. "Fix it or get out." The apprentice swallows his tears, trying not to think about the weeping woman by the well earlier. But not all guilds were so hard-hearted. The Butchers' Guild in some towns had a tradition of ritual lamenting during annual festivals, where they symbolically mourned the animals they slaughtered, an acknowledgement of loss woven into everyday work. This was public emotion sanctioned by craft and custom. And now, a little humor to lighten the forge's heat. Why did the apprentice blacksmith refuse to cry? Because he didn't want to forge tears. "I'll see myself out." Another. What do you call a guild meeting with no tears? A dry run. And one more. Why did the shoemaker always cry quietly? Because loud sobbing ruined the sole purpose. Guilds also played a political role in medieval towns. Their control over emotional expression wasn't just about decorum. It was about power. Controlling when and how people cried could reinforce hierarchies between masters and apprentices, men and women, insiders and outsiders. For example, apprentices were often expected to mask vulnerability to show their readiness for independence. Public crying could signal weakness, inviting humiliation or even expulsion from the guild. Masters, meanwhile, used emotional restraint to demonstrate authority. The guild's regulation of tears also connected to wider urban policies. Town councils sometimes coordinated with guilds to maintain public order, which included managing noise and disturbances, tears included. Imagine a town council meeting where guild leaders discuss a new ordinance. No crying louder than the bell toll during market hours. Practical, if a bit grim. In the middle of all this discipline and regulation, it's worth remembering that emotions weren't just suppressed. They were also harnessed. Tears could be symbols of loyalty, grief, or communal identity when expressed at the right time and place. So next time you imagine a medieval craftsman, don't just picture grim faces and calloused hands. Think also of the tightrope walk between feeling and showing, grief and stoicism. You're walking the same tightrope now, carried along by the rhythms of a world where tears were never just personal. They were political, social, and sometimes even professional. Hold on tight. The town's emotional landscape is about to get even more complicated. As you wander farther through the medieval town's winding streets, your ears pick up a very different kind of public voice, the loud, booming announcements of the town crier. Imagine a man standing atop a wooden platform, bell in hand, shouting news, proclamations, and warnings to a gathering crowd. His voice cuts through the usual clatter of the marketplace like a knife through stale bread. Now here's the medieval irony. While the town crier is paid and celebrated for shouting loudly in public, anyone else making a similar noise, especially crying, might face scorn, fines, or worse. Loud voices had licenses, but loud emotions often did not. The town crier's role was crucial. In an age before newspapers, radios, or smartphones, he was the living broadcast, the human megaphone. His announcements kept townsfolk informed about laws, taxes, royal decrees, missing persons, and market days. His booming voice was both a tool of order and control. One mainstream historical fact is that town criers were officially appointed by municipal authorities and sometimes granted special privileges, including exemptions from certain laws. They were town celebrities, recognized and protected. But the contrast between the town crier's loud proclamations and the discouraged loud crying is striking. Why was shouting for official purposes accepted, but sobbing for personal reasons not? This brings us to the heart of medieval views on public noise and emotional expression. Controlled loudness was a symbol of power and order, while uncontrolled loudness signaled chaos and disorder. The town crier's voice represented authority. The crying woman's sobs represented vulnerability and disturbance. The social meaning of sound was highly coded. Here's a fringe tidbit. In some towns, town criers carried official scrolls or bells that marked their authority, and unauthorized loud noise without such symbols could be interpreted as disturbing the peace or even as insurrection. Loud crying without sanction risked association with rebellion or madness. An open scholarly debate surrounds the auditory politics of medieval towns. Historians argue whether noise regulation was less about volume and more about who made the noise and why. Loud official voices upheld hierarchy. Loud personal voices threatened it. So imagine yourself as a passerby hearing the town crier's bell. His call commands attention. People listen, obey, and move on. Now imagine someone else crying just as loudly in the same square. The reaction: annoyance, suspicion, maybe even punishment. There's a bittersweet humor here. The man paid to shout could break silence with impunity. The woman crying out of pain or frustration was silenced. Let's pause for a few light jokes. Why did the town crier never cry? Because his tears wouldn't reach the back of the square. Another: what's the difference between a town crier and a weeping widow? One's paid to be loud, the other fined. And one more: why don't town criers attend funerals? Because they don't want to drown out the mourners. The town crier's voice also shaped the soundscape of medieval towns, regulating when and how public attention shifted. His announcements could stop markets, start fairs, or declare curfews. His loudness was a social tool. In contrast, uncontrolled crying disrupted that order, unpredictably shifting focus and emotional energy. Towns feared such disruptions because they could cascade into larger disturbances. Interestingly, town criers sometimes had to yell over the noise of crying mourners or angry crowds, revealing a constant struggle for auditory dominance in public spaces. And while the town crier's voice was official, scripted, and expected, crying was spontaneous, emotional, and unpredictable. That unpredictability made it dangerous to the social order. In some towns, legal codes explicitly punished anyone who raised their voice above the town crier outside authorized times. Crying, especially loud crying, was included in these restrictions. So, the paradox: loud official voices were protected, loud personal voices were policed. The town crier's bell was a symbol of civic order. Tears were often a symbol of social disorder. As you listen to the town crier's booming voice fade into the distance, think about the emotional volume dial medieval towns had to adjust constantly. Who got to be heard, and when? Whose pain was visible, and whose was silenced? It's a noisy, complicated world, and the town crier was the loudest voice, but not always the most honest. As the town crier's bell fades, your mind turns to the curious and often baffling medieval medical theories that tried to explain crying. Forget modern psychology. Medieval doctors looked to the ancient humoral theory to make sense of tears. It's a theory as tangled as the ivy climbing the old stone walls, but stick with me. It's crucial to understanding why crying wasn't just a social problem, but a medical one. Imagine a medieval physician in his cluttered chamber, lit by flickering candles and filled with jars of mysterious herbs and odd animal parts. He consults his dusty tomes, then tells you that your tears are caused by an imbalance of your body's four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Crying, they say, is a sign that one of these humors has gotten out of whack. Now, here's a mainstream historical fact. The humoral theory, inherited from Hippocrates and Galen, dominated medieval medicine. Excess of black bile was often linked to melancholy, a condition associated with sadness and tears. Physicians believed that people prone to crying had an overabundance of this sad humor, which could cause physical and mental ailments. But the theory didn't stop there. Too much blood, called sanguinity, could cause joyful tears or excitement. Phlegm was linked to lethargy and numbness, while yellow bile could bring irritability and anger. Not exactly crying, but related emotional upheaval. Doctors sometimes prescribed treatments to balance the humors, like bloodletting, purging, or herbal remedies. And yes, they considered excessive crying a symptom needing cure. One might say, "You cry too much, your black bile is out of control. We'll fix that with leeches." Here's an unusual fringe tidbit. Some medieval physicians thought that crying could be good medicine if it helped purge excess humors. So tears were both a symptom and a cure. A fascinating contradiction. Yet, other medical texts warned that too much crying drained vital bodily fluids and could lead to weakness or even death. Physicians advised moderation, or better yet, emotional control. This tension reflects a larger medieval struggle to classify emotions as both physical and spiritual phenomena. Crying wasn't just about feeling sad. It was about health, balance, and even morality. And here's a light joke for you. Why did the medieval doctor carry a bucket? To catch all the tears he'd prescribed to his patients. Another. How many humors does it take to cry? Just one. Black bile's got it covered. And one more. Why didn't medieval physicians trust emotional people? Because their humors were all over the place. The humoral theory also influenced ideas about gender and crying. Women were thought to have more cold and moist humors, making them more prone to tears and emotional excess. Men, being hot and dry, were expected to be stoic and less tearful. These medical ideas fed social expectations and justifications for emotional norms. If women cried more, it was natural due to their bodies. If men cried, it was often seen as a failure to control base impulses. Some scholars debate how seriously medieval people took these medical explanations in daily life. Were they medical truths or cultural myths reinforcing social order? The answer is likely both. Medicine and culture were deeply intertwined. Also, the link between tears and physical health made public crying even more charged. Cry too much, and people might worry you were ill or possessed. This connects back to earlier sections. Public crying wasn't just a nuisance. It was a visible sign of potential sickness or spiritual trouble. Physicians might even be called to diagnose someone who cried uncontrollably in public, blending medical and social intervention. Imagine you're a medieval town doctor called to examine a woman who's been weeping by the market well for days. You check her pulse, sniff some herbs, and mutter about imbalance of humours. Your prescription? Rest, potions, and maybe less public sobbing. The intertwining of medicine, emotion, and social order makes medieval crying uniquely complex. It's not just about feelings, it's about bodies, spirits, and communities trying to make sense of human vulnerability. So as you picture yourself in that doctor's chamber, smelling of rosemary and rue, remember that tears were never just tears. They were signs, symptoms, and social signals all at once. You might be feeling a bit drained yourself now. That's okay. We're just getting started. Now, as your thoughts drift back into the murky streets and shadowed alleys of the medieval town, you find yourself drawn to a place that doubles as both punishment and spectacle. The stocks. These wooden contraptions, with holes for hands and head, were designed to publicly shame offenders, often in the bustling town square, where the world could watch and judge. And guess what? Stocks and crying often went hand in hand. Picture a poor soul locked in the stocks, exposed to the elements and the relentless gaze of passers-by. The punishment was as much about humiliation as about physical discomfort. It was a public performance of penance and correction, and for many, the experience was overwhelming. Tears flowed freely, sometimes out of sorrow, sometimes out of frustration, and sometimes simply because it was cold and miserable. One mainstream historical fact is that towns used the stocks to punish a wide range of offences, from minor thefts to public disorder, including unseemly weeping or causing disturbances through loud crying. If you sobbed too loudly or disturbed the peace while locked in, you risked extended time in the stocks, or worse, verbal abuse from the crowd. The stocks were as much a social theatre as a correctional device. The crying prisoner became a kind of spectacle, their tears part of the public drama. And the townspeople? Some sympathized, many mocked, and others treated it as entertainment. Here's a fringe tidbit for you. In some records from England and the Low Countries, prisoners in the stocks reportedly developed a kind of crying etiquette, learning to modulate their sobs to elicit sympathy without provoking harsher punishment. Too much noise could bring fresh wrath. Too little might suggest guilt or toughness. It was a delicate balance, like emotional tightrope walking. This leads into one of the open scholarly debates. Were tears in the stocks a genuine expression of suffering or a strategic performance? Some historians argue that crying was a form of protest, a way for the powerless to claim dignity and humanity. Others see it as capitulation, a forced admission of guilt and weakness. The act of crying in the stocks also intersected with medieval beliefs about public shame and repentance. Tears could be seen as a sign of true remorse, indicating the offender's willingness to reform. But they could also be dismissed as weakness or trickery. The townspeople's reaction to crying prisoners varied. Sometimes generous souls threw coins or food. Other times, cruel jeers filled the air. Public sentiment was a powerful force, influencing how long someone stayed in the stocks or whether they were eventually pardoned. Imagine a scene where a young man, shivering and tearful, catches the eye of a kindly merchant. The merchant tosses him a loaf of bread. The man's tears turn from fear to gratitude. It's a small moment of humanity amid the harsh spectacle. But in other moments, the crowd jeers, accusing the prisoner of being a coward or a fraud. The tears become a battleground of perception, real pain versus theatrical manipulation. The stocks were also a place where social hierarchies played out. A noble caught in the stocks was unthinkable, but commoners and the poor were frequent occupants. For them, public crying was both a vulnerability and a statement of social position. There's also evidence that some prisoners tried to use their tears strategically, to sway public opinion or elicit mercy from authorities. Crying became a form of communication, a language beyond words. Here's a light joke to ease the mood. Why don't prisoners in the stocks ever cry alone? Because misery loves company, and fresh bread. Another, what do you call a weeping prisoner? A stock market failure. And one more, why was the prisoner's tear so valuable? Because it was a liquid asset. Public punishment and emotional expression were deeply entwined in medieval towns. The stocks, with their unforgiving wood and relentless eyes, were a crucible of this relationship. As you imagine yourself watching from a distance, the prisoner's tears remind you that even in shame, there's humanity. Crying in the stocks was never just about punishment. It was about survival, identity, and the fragile line between power and powerlessness. So next time you feel overwhelmed, remember, in the Middle Ages, tears could be your sentence and your salvation. As you move on from the stocks, your path takes you to the shadowed chambers of the medieval courtroom, a place where the stakes are high, the accusations sharper than a knight's sword, and emotions are just as volatile as the verdicts. Here, crying wasn't just about personal sorrow. It could be a weapon or a liability, sometimes deciding your fate. In medieval trials, emotional displays were scrutinized with intensity. Tears, especially from women accused of crimes like witchcraft, heresy, or infanticide, could be interpreted in wildly different ways. Was the crying genuine remorse or cunning deceit? Was it a sign of guilt or a plea for mercy? Judges and juries weren't just looking for facts. They were reading emotions. One mainstream historical fact is that during the infamous witch trials, accused women's tears played a complicated role. Some judges saw tears as evidence of a soft heart and innocence, while others suspected them as manipulative performances. Public crying during interrogations could sway verdicts, but could also be twisted into signs of guilt. There are chilling accounts of accused women being pressured to cry to prove repentance. Their tears weighed alongside confessions and testimonies. Conversely, a lack of tears might be read as cold-heartedness or defiance, both dangerous in a highly superstitious context. A fringe tidbit to consider. In some regions, it was believed that witches could fake tears, producing false tears as part of their dark magic to deceive authorities. This belief heightened suspicion of any emotional display, turning tears into potential evidence of evil rather than innocence. The scholarly debate surrounding emotional expression in court centers on the performativity of tears. Were these displays sincere, coerced, or strategic? Did the fear of punishment force genuine feelings to the surface, or did accused individuals learn to use tears as survival tools? Historians continue to unravel these complex dynamics. Beyond witch trials, emotional control was a key factor in all legal proceedings. Crying could undermine credibility, suggesting weakness or guilt, but it could also humanize defendants, stirring compassion. Navigating this emotional minefield was perilous. Imagine a woman standing before the court, her hands trembling, tears streaming, voice breaking as she pleads for mercy. The room watches, waiting to interpret every sob and sniffle. In this moment, her tears are more than personal. They're legal evidence. At the same time, Men accused of crimes were often expected to mask emotions. A man who cried might be mocked or seen as unmanly, potentially losing social standing or respect, which could affect trial outcomes. Lightening the mood, here are some jokes you might appreciate. Why did the accused bring a tissue to court? To wipe away the evidence. Another, what's the lawyer's favorite tear? The one that makes the jury cry. And one more, why don't judges cry in court? Because it's a crying shame. Courtroom crying also intersected with religious ideas about confession and repentance. Tears could be signs of a repentant soul, sometimes influencing sentencing. Public weeping might earn reduced punishment or spiritual absolution. Yet, the pressure to display or suppress emotion was intense. Cry too much, and you seemed weak or deceitful. Cry too little, and you were callous or unrepentant. It was a no-win emotional trap. Outside the courtroom, rumors often swirled about how accused individuals managed their tears. Some allegedly practiced crying on cue, others fasted to appear pale and vulnerable. This intersection of law, emotion, and power highlights how medieval societies saw tears as both truth and performance. The courtroom was a stage where tears told stories that could condemn or save. As you listen to the echoes of a trial, consider how your own feelings might be interpreted under such scrutiny. It's a reminder that crying has always been more than private. It's political. You're halfway through our journey now. Take a deep breath. The story continues. As your mind turns away from the harsh judgments of the courtroom, you find yourself drawn toward the lofty chambers where kings and knights live, and sometimes, surprisingly, cry. Yes, even the toughest medieval lords occasionally shed tears, and the way those tears were perceived reveals much about the emotional politics of power. Imagine a grand hall, tapestries hanging heavy on stone walls, sunlight filtering through stained glass windows depicting saints and battles. A king mourns the death of his son. His eyes glisten as he addresses the court, his voice thick with sorrow. But is this sorrow a private feeling or a public performance? And what does it mean for a man expected to embody strength and authority? One mainstream historical fact is that public displays of emotion by rulers were often carefully staged. Kings and nobles cried in moments of ritualized mourning, religious devotion, or political drama. Their tears were signs of humanity, piety, or legitimate grief, but always within bounds. However, these displays were double-edged. Excessive weeping by men of power could be seen as dangerous weakness, potentially undermining their authority. Political rivals might seize on such moments to question a leader's capability. Take, for example, King Richard II of England, who famously wept in public during times of crisis. His tears were both a source of sympathy and mockery, fueling narratives about his supposed fragility and eventual downfall. A fringe tidbit is that some medieval chroniclers described knights shedding tears after battle, not just for loss, but as a spiritual cleansing. Crying was a way to release the trauma of violence and prepare for future combat. Yet this vulnerability was rarely spoken of openly, reserved for private moments or controlled ritual. An open scholarly debate concerns whether tears from powerful men were authentic emotional expressions or carefully controlled performances intended to manipulate public opinion. Were these men genuinely moved, or using tears as tools of statecraft? The answer is complex and varies by individual and context. Picture a knight returning from a brutal campaign, tears tracing lines through his dirt and blood. standing before his lord to recount the horrors of war. His sobs might earn respect for bravery and sensitivity, or skepticism and ridicule for softness. In contrast, lesser men showing similar tears risked accusations of cowardice. The emotional code was strict. Men of status could cry, but only when and how it served their image. Lightening the mood, here are a few jokes. Why don't knights cry in battle? Because their armor is too tough for tears to escape. Another, what's a king's favorite tear? The one that floods the treasury. And one more, why did the nobleman bring a handkerchief to court? To wipe away his royal tears. The display of tears by kings and knights was a delicate dance, balancing personal feeling with public expectation. Tears could humanize rulers, making them relatable, but too many could erode their aura of invincibility. Interestingly, some historians argue that tears were essential to medieval concepts of masculinity. Expressing grief showed moral depth and honor, but it had to be carefully regulated. Public weeping was allowed, even required, but only within ritual frameworks, mourning a fallen comrade, lamenting the state of the realm, or during religious ceremonies. Outside these contexts, emotional restraint was prized. Kings and knights who lost control risked losing the loyalty of their followers and the respect of their peers. Imagine the tension. A lord weeping for his wife's death at a public feast, balancing genuine sorrow with the need to maintain command. Every tear was a message, interpreted and judged by those watching. This dynamic reveals medieval tears as not just personal but profoundly political. The emotional lives of rulers shaped perceptions of power and legitimacy. So as you picture yourself in that great hall, remember that behind the grandeur and steel, even the strongest hearts sometimes break, and sometimes the tears they shed speak louder than any sword. As the grandeur of kings and knights fades from your mind, your journey takes a turn toward the whispered, shadowy corners of medieval superstition, the world where tears took on mystical meanings and ancient beliefs shaped how people understood crying. In these times, emotions were more than personal experiences. They were woven into the fabric of folklore and magic. Imagine a darkened village at dusk, where villagers gather around a fire, sharing stories about ghosts, curses, and mysterious tears. In this world, tears weren't just water falling from eyes. They were potent symbols, carriers of power and omen. One mainstream historical fact is that many medieval folk believed tears had supernatural properties. Some thought that tears could protect against the evil eye, a malevolent gaze believed to cause harm or bad luck. People might collect their tears in small containers, thinking these tear jars could shield them from curses or misfortune. Others believed that tears could be used in magic and healing. For example, a mother's tears might be thought to possess protective qualities for her child, or tears shed at a saint's shrine could bring blessings. Conversely, witches were sometimes said to use stolen tears in spells, making tears a double-edged symbol. A fringe tidbit. In some rural areas, it was believed that a crying ghost could only be appeased if someone collected its tears and cast them into a river, releasing the spirit from torment. This belief gave tears a spiritual significance beyond the living. An open scholarly debate revolves around the symbolic meanings of tears in medieval culture. Were tears primarily seen as spiritual expressions of sorrow and repentance, or did they hold magical powers in folk belief? The evidence suggests a fascinating overlap. Tears functioned both as markers of inner emotion and as magical substances with tangible effects. Picture a village healer carefully gathering tears from a grieving widow to use in a healing potion, blending emotional pain with practical medicine. Tears here are tangible proof of human suffering and a means to transform it. The superstitions around crying also fed social behaviors. For example, people might be wary of excessive crying in certain contexts, fearing that it attracted evil spirits or brought bad luck. This fear added another layer to why public crying was often discouraged. There were also beliefs linking crying to omens and predictions. A sudden outburst of tears without apparent cause might be seen as a warning of impending disaster, plague, famine, or war. Such tears were interpreted as messages from the divine or the supernatural realm. This belief sometimes led to rituals of cleansing involving tears. Villagers might perform ceremonies to wash away the bad omen carried by tears, involving water, herbs, and prayer. And yes, some of these practices sound downright mystical today, but they were deeply real to the people living them. Here's a bit of medieval humor for you. Why did the witch cry during her trial? Because she was spellbound by emotion. Another, what do you call tears shed by a ghost? Boo-hoo. And one more, why don't spirits cry? Because they don't have eyes to water. These superstitions influenced not just individuals, but community norms. Public crying wasn't just an emotional act. It was a social signal loaded with potential spiritual consequences. People's fear of crying attracting spirits or curses might explain why many towns had strict rules about when and where crying was acceptable. Imagine a young woman warned by elders not to cry near the well at night, lest her tears summon restless ghosts. Or a farmer told to keep his sorrows inside, fearing that public weeping would ruin the harvest. These beliefs show how crying was embedded in a medieval worldview where the seen and unseen worlds overlapped. So as you sit quietly, perhaps wiping a tear yourself, remember that in medieval times, those tears might have been seen as both vulnerable and powerful, tiny rivers flowing between the human and the divine. You're getting closer now. Hold on. Your footsteps now lead you to the flickering stages of medieval theatre, where tears played a starring role in drama, morality plays, and community storytelling. Here, crying was not just natural, it was essential, a tool for teaching, manipulating, and uniting audiences. Picture a crowded village square transformed into a makeshift theatre, where actors in simple costumes enact stories of saints, sinners, and everyday folk. The air is thick with anticipation. As the plot unfolds, tears flow, both on stage and in the audience. One mainstream historical fact is that medieval plays often featured scenes designed to evoke tears, especially during passion plays depicting Christ's suffering or morality tales warning of sin's consequences. Crying was encouraged to deepen engagement and reflection. Actors were skilled in eliciting tears from the audience, using music, poignant dialogue, and dramatic gestures. Tears signaled that the moral lessons had been absorbed, that the community was spiritually moved. An unusual fringe tidbit: some medieval theatre troupes reportedly trained professional criers, or weepers, to perform alongside actors, their sobs amplifying the emotional atmosphere and guiding audience reactions. There's lively scholarly debate on whether tears in medieval theatre were authentic emotional responses or socially conditioned performances. Some argue audiences cried genuinely, swept up in the religious fervor and storytelling. Others suggest that crying was a ritualized behavior, expected and even rehearsed as part of communal experience. Imagine yourself sitting on a wooden bench, the flickering torchlight casting shadows on faces glistening with tears. The collective crying becomes a shared act of devotion and social bonding. Beyond religious plays, Secular performances also used tears for dramatic effect. Tragedies about betrayal, loss, or injustice moved audiences to tears, highlighting universal human experiences. This theatrical use of tears created a space where emotion was public, sanctioned, and meaningful. Unlike the chaos of unsanctioned crying in marketplaces or courts, tears here were part of the performance, a bridge between actors and community. Here are a few light-hearted jokes for the occasion. Why did the actor bring a handkerchief to the stage? To catch the audience's tears. Another, what's a playwright's favorite emotion? Crying with laughter and sorrow. And one more, why don't medieval actors cry off stage? Because the drama's on. Medieval theatre also served as a safe outlet for expressing and exploring grief and sorrow. It allowed people to process collective traumas, like plague or war, in controlled settings. In this way, tears on stage were both cathartic and educational, reinforcing community values and spiritual lessons. The ritualized nature of theatrical crying contrasts sharply with the unpredictability of tears in everyday life. It shows how medieval society sought to contain and give meaning to emotion. As you watch the actors' tears blend with those of the audience, you feel the power of shared sorrow and the human need for connection. Soon we'll approach the final act, how the rules and perceptions around public crying began to shift, setting the stage for the modern world's understanding of tears. For now, let the echoes of the theatre's weeping linger gently in your mind. As your journey through medieval towns draws to a close, you find yourself reflecting on the long fade of forbidden tears, the slow, often reluctant shift in how public crying was understood and tolerated. It's a story of change, tension, and the beginning of new ideas about emotion, privacy, and expression. Imagine a town square not unlike the one where you first heard that unexpected sobbing. But now, centuries later, the town is changing. Markets bustle with new energy. Print shops spread news in ink instead of bells, and ideas about the individual begin to stir. Public weeping, once rigidly policed, starts to soften in meaning. One mainstream historical fact is that by the late medieval and early modern periods, public attitudes toward crying began to shift. The rise of humanism, changing religious ideas, and early scientific thought contributed to new understandings of emotion. Crying was increasingly seen not just as a sign of disorder or weakness, but as a natural, even healthy expression of human feeling. Writers and thinkers started to explore tears as signals of empathy, compassion, and inner truth. However, the transition was uneven. Old laws and customs lingered, still punishing loud or inappropriate crying. The tension between control and expression remained a social battleground. An unusual fringe tidbit. Some Renaissance physicians began to study tears under early microscopes, fascinated by their composition and wondering about their spiritual significance. This scientific curiosity marked a new era in understanding emotion. Open scholarly debates focus on how and why these changes occurred. Were they driven by shifts in religious practice, the rise of individualism, or cultural transformations in art and literature? Probably all of the above. The long fade of forbidden tears also relates to the changing roles of gender and class. Women's tears began to be romanticized in literature, associated with virtue and sensitivity, while men's tears became slightly more acceptable as signs of moral seriousness. Public crying moved gradually from a regulated disturbance to a form of emotional communication and connection. This paved the way for the modern idea that tears can be healing, expressive, and even beautiful. Imagine now the same town square filled with new kinds of cries. At weddings, funerals, plays, and personal moments, tears flow more freely, less policed, part of everyday human experience. But echoes of medieval attitudes remain. We still judge when, where, and how people cry, and who is allowed to cry publicly. The medieval tightrope of tears lives on, subtly shaping modern emotion. A few light jokes to end on. Why did the medieval town finally embrace crying? Because they realized tears were the original social network. Another. What do tears and medieval laws have in common? Both are hard to ignore. And one more. Why did the weeping woman bring a book to the market? To read between the tears. As you settle into the quiet after this long journey, let the image of those ancient streets fade gently, replaced by a softer understanding. Crying, after all, is one of the oldest and most human things we do. It connects us across time, across centuries of rules, rituals, and stories. So now, as your eyelids grow heavy and the world dims, know that you're safe. You've traveled through history's tears and come through wiser, softer. Let the tears rest. Let the heart ease. Good night.